We all know agents can perform tasks. What we're not talking about enough is their ability to schedule tasks for themselves for a later time in the future, assuring that they're triggered at that time to execute the task without you having to be present for it. At a high level, this is how OpenClaw works, and it opens up a ton of possibilities to use agents more productively. So today I wanted to discuss a number of things. First, I wanted to give you guys a quick preview of a workflow that I've set up that gives you an idea of how you can use scheduling in agent workflows. Then we'll go through the idea of the cron protocol and scheduling in automation, what that means, and how to better understand it to use it more effectively in your AI agents. Then lastly, we'll go through a number of best practices you can apply, right, when using agents that can trigger themselves. Firstly, you need to understand that the logic that lies behind scheduling automation is referred to as the cron protocol. This is what is used to sort of schedule automations and to schedule tasks, right? Also outside of large language models. The reason that this is important is because in this workflow, you're going to see the term cron several times. You're going to see cron create and cron list. Cron create means creating a scheduled task. Cron list means the list of scheduled tasks that Claude has at that moment. Another thing that's important is that I've set this up to run in session, which means that it only runs as long as the Claude Code session is open. Obviously, your device also has to be on. There are ways to set up tasks to run even when the device is actually even off, but this is more complex and also comes with more risks. So just to help you guys think about this, give you sort of the idea of the concept, I've set it up to only run in session. Now, there are several ways to run scheduled tasks in Claude Code, one of which you might be familiar with is the scheduled task interface here in the Claude Code app. The reason I'm not using this is because this only allows you to set up scheduled tasks that are recurring, right? Which means that you set it to run once every Wednesday. What I want to do is actually set up something where Claude Code thinks about what it did, and on the basis of that, set a specific trigger for a specific time in the future for it to be triggered again. So that's what we're going to be doing. So the way I have this set up is I have the Claude Code extension in anti-gravity, and what this workflow does is it goes out and it does AI news research, looks at the latest news in AI. Then on the basis of what it finds on that, it creates a brief report that it updates in my Notion database, and then as a result of that, this is where the scheduling comes in, it determines when it should be triggered next to continue doing research. So if it finds, for example, a bunch of news stories that are very current, that are very relevant, and that are moving quickly, it'll determine that it needs to run maybe in the next 30 minutes or an hour from now, and it'll set a scheduled task to run at that time. If it doesn't find anything like that, it'll trigger itself to maybe run 4 hours later. So the way I have this set up is I have this all handled in the skill AI news research. So this is the AI news research skill. That's where I have it actually go and do the AI news research. And then I have the scheduling logic handled in my claude.markdown file. Now, the thing that makes this particularly interesting is that I also have this connected to my Notion database. And what I have it do is for every scheduled task that it creates, I have it create an entry in my Notion database so that I can see what it plans to do. So if you look here, this is my Notion database, and this is a scheduled task that Claude currently has, where it at 6:59, it has to run the AI news research skill again. This is the reason, right? So in the previous run, it determined that this is what's going on. So this is the reason why it plans to run again at that time. And then this is the task description, right? So basically just to run the AI news research skill, it has to go and do this. The reason I did this is because it is easier for me then to see when it plans to do what, and it sort of gives me a visual interface of it. With Notion, you also have this like calendar interface where you can actually see it in like a calendar interface. You can get an idea of when it plans to run. So before every run, what it also does as a result of that is it goes through the Notion database, it looks at all the entries that are there, and then it looks at its own internal cron list, its own internal list of scheduled tasks, and it makes sure that those are reconciled. This is what makes it that even if I go into a new session, right, I can ask it to run, and it'll first go and check in my Notion database if there's any entries that it doesn't have in its own internal list, and it'll reconcile them. So every entry that doesn't exist yet as a scheduled task within Claude, it'll create that scheduled task so that as long as that session is open, it'll have all the tasks that it has to do for that day. So right now I only have one, but if I ask Claude, what do we have scheduled for today? So it sees no scheduled jobs. So it first looks at its own internal list and says, okay, I have no scheduled jobs. Then it goes into my Notion database. And now it's going to go through all the entries that I have. I currently only have one for the sake of simplicity, but it's going to find that entry. So it's running that, fetches something, reconciliation results. So it found one entry that has to be run at this time. It sees that it has no active cron job. So what does it do? It immediately creates the cron internally. And here's what's on the schedule for today. AI News Research scheduled at 6:59. Yes, just created. So now it's aligned itself with my Notion database. So you see, this is what we refer to as like a centralized state. The Notion database acts as a sort of centralized state. It goes in there, it checks what it has to do, right? And it makes sure that if it doesn't already have that in its own internal schedule list, its own sort of internal to-do list, that it reconciles that before every run, right? But also when I ask it to do that, it reconciles it immediately. So now, if I go to a new session and I say, run the AI News Research skill. So you see, I just triggered the AI News Research skill to run. And now what it's going to do is it's going to look at all the domains that are approved. One thing that's very important if you're running agents to run autonomously, or if you're asking them to run on the basis of a scheduled automation, a scheduled trigger, you want to make sure they have all the permissions that they need. There's no point in having it run scheduled if it's going to run into constant blocks having to ask for approval. You want it to make sure that it has all the permissions it needs to be able to run. So what I did is in this settings.json, to have some level of control, I not only gave it access to all the things it needs, I did this for every domain, every specific domain that I wanted to go to. This way, and I embedded that into the skill, that these are the only domains it should use. This way, it doesn't go off and run into any sort of domain where it gets blocked and has to ask me for approval. So it has everything it needs to run. It doesn't need to ask me for approval. What you see here on this side now is that it found did the reconciliation. It looked at the entry as the current run. And what you'll see as a result of that, if we go to the Notion database, you'll see that it's now set this one as in progress, and it's updated the time to 5:50, which is now. The reason for this is that I triggered it manually to run. So then it goes in, it says, okay, I actually have one entry. I'm going to run that one now instead of later. I'm going to update the time and set it to in progress. So it's running this one right now. So if we go back to anti-gravity, we'll see that it's doing the web search. Good, enough data collected, very good. What it's going to do now is going to append this into the audit log. Again, when you're running agents like this, where you're having them doing scheduled automation, it's important to have a log of what they're doing. Now, obviously, in my Notion database, I have the task description, I have the scheduled reason, I have all these things logged there. But just to also have it locally, I have this audit log.md file, which is very long now. But what it does is, at the end of every run like this, it creates a log where it writes down why it planned to run the next run at this time, what it did in that run, right? Just so that I can always refer back to it to get an idea of what it did. But also that when I run it later, when I run Claude Code to run later, right, it can go to the audit log and refer to what happened in the last 3 runs to get an idea of what it should do next, right? So that's the audit log file. Always very relevant, always very important to use when you are using agents like this. So, okay, now it's synthesis complete. Now it's creating the briefing page. While it's creating the briefing page, we can take a moment to look closer into the Claude markdown file. I'm not going to take you guys through this line by line, but to put it very simply, this just basically handles all the scheduling. So what it does is it does that reconciliation at the beginning, making sure that everything is aligned. Then at the end of it, it determines on the basis of what happened in the last run, when the next run should be. And it gets the reasoning for that, it gets that from the skill. So in the skill, I've determined at the very end here, you'll see that it sort of needs to look at the content urgency, the story count, and on the basis of that, determine, right, with this little setup here, right, how important it is, and then when it should run next. So then it gives that on to the Claude markdown file, and then it sets the next, uses that logic to determine the next entry, right? So you can see it created the page. Right, now it's determining the next run. It sees no scheduled job because it just ran the last scheduled job. So you'll see here that in a second, it'll set this one to completed. And then it'll create there we go, right? This is the next one, right? So it set the next one to be scheduled, right? And then it'll set this one to completed here in a second. And that is how it'll continue going. There, as you can see, it set this one to done. And it set this one to scheduled. So it did this run, and then it immediately scheduled when it should run next, and it determined that 7:20 would be the best time. So if I now also go to my calendar, this is something, if I refresh the page here, this is the next thing that it has scheduled at 7:20. So you see in this way, right? Again, Claude uses its own thinking. You give it some instructions, you give it a sort of general logic, but on the basis of that, it uses its own intelligence, its own reasoning to determine, hey, what should I do next? And when should I be triggered next, right? And that is what makes this so powerful. You can use this for all sorts of things. Using the power of the reasoning of large language models for them to think for themselves when they should be triggered next, and then give them the power to be triggered next at a time without you having to be present. Right? The session has to be open, of course, but you don't actually have to be present for it to run, right? It'll run by itself. So if you go here and there, we have an overview of what it did, urgent, the next run, it writes that down, and this is the cron that it created internally. So now at 7:20, this will run again, and it'll do the AI news research again, and then when it does that, at the end of that, it'll determine when it should run next and create another run for itself. So how can we think about this a little deeper, right? When you have any sort of automated process, you want to think about how this needs to be triggered, right? Maybe a code-based process like a Python script, or node-based like an n8n flow, or a large language model, right? You need a way to trigger the configuration that you've set up to start running. So the very obvious way is just manually, just direct execution. You press the button for it to start running. You tell the agent to start doing the thing you've asked it to do, right? And it starts doing it at that moment. The other way is event-based triggers. This is when the process is triggered by some sort of external event, right? So this could be, this process runs whenever an email is deleted, or this process runs whenever an email is received from a specific mail address. The way that we're interested in today is time-based triggers, right? Also referred to as cron, because the logic behind it is referred to as the cron protocol. So you'll often hear of like a cron job, right? The reason for that is because the protocol behind it is the cron protocol. And this is when you have something triggered on the basis of some configuration of time. So you could do that like setting it to run with some recurringly, setting it to run every Wednesday at noon or every 2 weeks, or to set it to run every Wednesday for the next 6 months at a specific time. But you can also use fixed point scheduling, where you have it run at a precise moment, where you say, hey, this process runs at on the 15th of January, 2027 at 2 p.m., right? And then it'll run exactly at that time. Now, when you couple this with large language models, you get a ton of very powerful possibilities. If you look back at the n8n days, people would have these n8n AI agents, right? And those would have like an OpenAI node somewhere, and those would also be scheduled. They'd be scheduled to run at a certain interval. The difference is, with those, you had to set the schedule, right? And that's the same thing here. If you use Claude Code schedule task, you set it to run once every Wednesday, which is also very useful and also very powerful. However, the true power comes in when you let the agent reason itself and think for itself when it thinks it would be best, right, for it to be triggered again on the basis of what it knows, on the basis of what it did. So you take, for example, the following scenario. Let's say you need to follow up with leads, right? The old way to do it, right, if you look at like here, right, phase 1 classic AI would be, hey, I need to follow up with this lead. And then, you ask Claude to help you, and would give you, an email that you could send to that lead. It would give you, you have to give it the information about the lead. Obviously, you have to give it the thread of the email that you've been having with the emails you've been having with the lead so far. And then we'll go, hey, here's what you can message them. Agentic AI, as we all know, goes a step further. You connect it to your CRM. It gets everything it needs to know about the lead. You connect it to your email system, and then it reads everything it needs to need and sends the email itself. Autonomous AI, this is when you give the AI a heartbeat, when you start using, scheduling within it, would not only follow up with the lead itself, it would read the response from the lead that says, hey, I'm actually in the middle of a product launch right now. Mail me again in about 3 weeks, then we can follow up on, this deal. And then as a result of that, it would say, okay, once to be followed up with in 3 weeks, I'm going to create a schedule for myself to be triggered 3 weeks from now at this time. And then it would autonomously, without you having to be there, right, follow up with the lead without you having to think about it. This is the difference. This is how we go from classic AI to agentic AI to autonomous AI, the AI really working for itself. So when using agents in this way, there's obviously a ton of possibilities. The example that I gave was very simple. It goes out, does research, comes back, and determines when it should run again. But you can probably imagine, right, if you think of things like OpenClaw and some of the stories that we've seen, how powerful this can get when an agent can sort of determine for itself when it's triggered. So there's a couple of things that I think we should consider when using agents in this way. Number one, you want to make sure you provide high-level system prompts. You don't want to give it very step-by-step, very specific instructions. And the reason for this is because when an agent is running according to a scheduled trigger, it's running at a moment where you're not paying attention to it, right? And you're not there to steer it and guide it to run in a particular way. So you want to make sure it has everything that it needs to run in that moment. And to let it do that, you want to give it a little more space to reason for itself. If you give it something very specific that it can't do because it doesn't have the permission, right? So you want to make sure it has all the permissions, or because it runs into some sort of roadblock because the instruction you gave it was highly specific, right? It might fall into a loop, or it'll break and stop running. That's not what you want. You want to give it sort of the space to sort of reason for itself, give it very well written, right? But sort of more high level, right, instructions on how to think, on how to approach and achieve the specific goal, as opposed to saying do these specific things, right? In addition, you want to have some sort of an audit trail, right? I had the audit log.md where it keeps track of everything that it did. I also have my Notion database where for every entry, there's a scheduling reason, right? So I can show you here, right? It shows this is the reason why it's doing this, and it also shows what it's going to do for that task. So you want to have a way where you're tracking what is happening and when, right? Especially important when you're working with a team. Human in loop checkpoint. In my Notion database, I can actually set, this one's actually running now, but I can actually set a scheduled entry to cancel. So I just show you here, if I do canceled, right, it'll actually not run that one, right? So that's a little way in which I'm sort of acting as the human in the loop. But obviously, in my setup, since it only runs in session, I also have the ability to just go in and tell it to stop running, or tell it to delete all the crons, just cron delete, and it won't run. You want to have some process to where you can still interfere, where you can still be in the loop, but also to where for certain tasks, you actually have to approve, right? That's actually what it means with human loop checkpoints. You want to be able to say, hey, for this thing, ask me for approval first. I want you to reach out to me, ask me for approval first, and only then should you continue to run. The next thing you want to think of is have some sort of centralized state persistence. This is what I was using Notion for. Also serves as a good interface to sort of see what is going to happen and when and why. So if we go back to Notion again, right? I had this calendar interface where you could sort of see what is happening and when. So you see it as we were talking, it did these, and it created another thing scheduled for itself. You can see it did this one, this is in progress, and it just scheduled. So it just did these, and it scheduled another thing to run for later. And here I just have an interface of everything that's happening, right? And I can see what's happening, but also Claude will always refer, right, to what's happening in here every time it runs, right? So that was that reconciliation protocol that I was talking about. It's going to come back. It's going to make sure that it looks at what's in there. On the basis of what it's in there, it determines what it should do next. It doesn't come up with its own thing. So you have one place where you're sort of, managing the state of everything. Then you want to manage your context window. So obviously I have the audit log and I have my Notion. I don't have this set up yet, but what I could do is I could set up another process that makes sure that it creates a summary every time of those things. And every time it runs, it uses the summary to run. So it doesn't have to fill up the entire context window with all the details of the run, but it can refer to the audit log and refer to the Notion to do that. And then lastly, if you're running a very important process, if you're running AI at a very, let's say an enterprise level, I didn't have this in my workspace because I don't need it. But if you have it running at an enterprise level, if you have it running completely out of session, so a scheduled automation that runs even when your device is off, for example, you want to have some kind of circuit breaker. You want to have something that says, hey, under these conditions, break off the process and stop running everything, right? AI can start running off and doing some very powerful things, but also some kind of scary things. So some sort of deterministic process, I would say, let's say some sort of hard-coded script that says, hey, if a cron has been fired in the last hour 1,000 times, which shouldn't even be possible, break off this process, right? Stop from running and send an alert out so that we can check what's going on. So that was it, right? My goal with this video was to nudge you guys to think a little bit about how you can use scheduled automation in your AI workflows. If I did that, let me know. If I didn't do that, also let me know. Thank you very much for watching. Till next time.